The lightless corridor stretched before him, narrow as a coffin and smelling faintly of ozone. Garrett's flashlight sputtered against the warped, metallic walls of the abandoned research vessel Eidolon, casting long, leering shadows. Somewhere behind him, the faint hum of the team's transport shuttle purred like a distant animal, ready for retreat. But Garrett had come too far to turn back now. "Any signs of the crew?" crackled Lena's voice over the comm, static gnawing at the edges of her words. She sounded half bored, half nervous, a tightrope act Garrett had learned to recognize. "Not yet," Garrett replied, voice low. The silence of the ship pressed against his eardrums. "Just more of this damage. It's everywhere." Damage wasn't quite the word. The walls were pitted and warped, as though the Eidolon had been subjected to impossible forces. Spaces were metal folded inward like origami, leaving yawning holes to nowhere. In other places, the surfaces shimmered unnaturally, as though reality itself had become malleable and half-forgotten. It was like walking through the fever dream of a deranged architect. Lena's voice crackled again. "You think it's related to their experiments? What was it called? Quantum coalescence." Garrett grimaced. The Eidolon had been a privately funded black ops vessel, the kind of ship the government publicly disowned but quietly insured. Its mission: to tamper with the boundaries of quantum physics. Reality harmonics, they called it in their official notes, but to Garrett, it sounded like unregulated pseudoscience. And now, the Eidolon was adrift, its crew missing, its hulls a mess of impossible geometries. "Could be," he said finally. "The records weren't clear on the risks, but I'd say this looks risky." Ahead, his flashlight caught a smear of something organic on the floor, a dark trail leading to a closed bulkhead door. Garrett approached cautiously, hand on his sidearm. "Lena," he said, "I've got." The light flickered. For a split second, everything disappeared: the corridor, the smear, even his own body. Garrett was adrift in a void, unmoored and gasping as though he'd been flung into space. And then the world snapped back into place. The corridor returned, but the smear on the floor was gone. "What the hell?" Garrett whispered, his voice trembling. "Garrett? You cut out. What's going on?" Lena's voice was sharp now, all traces of boredom gone. Garrett opened his mouth to respond when the bulkhead door groaned open, spilling a cold, bluish light into the corridor. He stepped inside. The room was vast and circular, dominated by a monolithic machine that pulsed with faint light. Its design was alien, literally. Garrett could see no rivets, no welds, nothing that indicated human craftsmanship. Its surface shimmered like an oil slick, and as he stepped closer, he felt a faint vibration in his chest, like standing too close to a subwoofer. This was it, the heart of the Eidolon. And then he saw them. The crew, or what was left of them. They were scattered around the room in twisted postures, their bodies contorted into forms that defied biology. One man was fused to the wall, his face frozen in an expression of unbearable ecstasy. A woman knelt in the center of the room, her head thrown back, her mouth open in a silent scream. Her arms were stretched upward, fingers fused into the machine itself. Garrett's stomach churned. "Lena," he hissed, backing toward the door. "I found the crew. There." The room shifted, not physically, but perceptually. The walls seemed to ripple. The machine's hum deepened into a low, thrumming chant that Garrett could feel in his teeth. The kneeling woman's head snapped toward him, her neck making a wet, cracking sound. She spoke, but not with her voice. The words seemed to come from the air itself, a symphony of whispers and screams that overlapped and repeated. "Do you hear it?" Garrett froze. "Do you feel it?" The whispers grew louder, swelling into a cacophony. Garrett clutched his ears, his flashlight clattering to the floor. The shadows of the room moved now, not passively, but with intent, curling toward him like hungry tendrils. "Join us," the voices hissed. "See what we've seen. No garret gast, stumbling backward. No." The kneeling woman's body convulsed, and a wave of light erupted from the machine, washing over Garrett like a tidal wave. The world disappeared again, but this time, it didn't come back the same. He was on a carnival midway, Bright lights flashed around him, garish and unsteady, as though the air itself was struggling to hold them in place. The ground was soft and uneven, squelching beneath his boots like flesh. Music played, a warped calliope tune that shifted erratically between cheerful and menacing. Garrett spun around, his heart hammering. The midway stretched endlessly in every direction, populated by faceless figures who wandered aimlessly, their hands clutching grotesque balloons shaped like screaming faces. He stumbled forward, desperate to find a way out, but every step seemed to lead him deeper into the nightmare. "Step right up," boomed a voice behind him. Garrett turned and saw a figure standing at a rickety booth. It wore a tattered carnival barker's outfit, its face hidden behind a cracked porcelain mask. The mask's expression shifted constantly, cycling between joy, sorrow, and rage. "Win a prize," the figure crooned, gesturing to an array of stuffed animals on the counter. Each one had a pair of human eyes that blinked in unison. "I don't," Garrett stammered, backing away. "Everyone plays," the barker interrupted, and its voice was no longer singular. It was the same cacophony that had spoken to him in the Eidolon. Garrett turned to run, but the midway had changed again. The faceless figures were closer now, their heads swiveling toward him in unison. "Play," they chanted. "Play, play, play." And above it all, the machine's hum reverberated, louder than ever, as the boundaries of reality buckled and cracked. Garrett didn't know how long he ran. Time didn't seem to exist in the carnival. He passed impossible rides, merry-go-rounds spinning backward, Ferris wheels made of bone, a hall of mirrors that reflected every possible version of himself except the one that was real. The faceless figures pursued him relentlessly, their chant never stopping. And then, in the distance, he saw it, a shimmering door pulsing with the same bluish light as the machine aboard the Eidolon. Garrett didn't hesitate. He lunged for the door, the faceless figures clawing at his heels. As he crossed the threshold, the carnival dissolved around him. He was back in the Eidolon, but he wasn't alone. The Eidolon had changed. Garrett's first instinct was relief, but it curdled in his chest the moment he registered the dim, flickering lights and the strange geometry around him. The ship was no longer a battered wreck drifting through the void. It was alive. The walls pulsed faintly, as if breathing, and their surfaces undulated with strange, organic textures. Veins of glowing blue light snaked through the corridors, pulsating rhythmically like a heartbeat. And then there were the voices. They whispered from the corners of his mind, soft at first but insistent. A dozen, 100, all speaking at once in tones that ranged from soothing murmurs to guttural screams. "Do you understand now?" they asked, overlapping and disjointed. Garrett staggered forward, clutching his head. His footsteps echoed weirdly, the sound warping and doubling back on itself as though space was collapsing inward. "Lena," he rasped into his comm, "do you copy?" Static. He tried again louder. "Lena, if you can hear me." "Garrett." Her voice cut through, faint and distorted. "Where are you? We've been trying to reach you for 20 minutes. "I don't know," Garrett said, his throat tight. I think I'm still on the ship, but it's different. The crew, they're part of something. The machine." A high-pitched shriek burst through the comm, and Garrett yanked the device away from his ear. The scream sounded almost human, layered with static and something that might have been laughter. "Garrett," Lena said again, her voice trembling. "Get out of there. Whatever's happening on that ship, it's spreading." "Spreading?" There was a pause. Then her voice dropped to a whisper. "The transport, it started changing, just like the Eidolon. I barely got out before the walls started closing in." Garrett's blood ran cold. The Eidolon's contamination wasn't contained. It was reaching outward, reshaping everything it touched. "I'll find a way back," he said, though the words felt hollow. Before Lena could respond, the lights around him dimmed further, and the hum of the ship deepened into a rumble that shook the deck beneath his feet. Garrett froze, heart pounding, as something moved in the shadows ahead. It stepped into the faint light, a hulking, misshapen figure with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its head was too large, its face a featureless mask of flesh. It moved toward him in jerky, disjointed motions, as though it were a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. Garrett raised his weapon. "Stay back." The creature paused, tilting its grotesque head. Then, with a bone-rattling shriek, it lunged. Garrett fired, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the creature's distorted form. The bullet struck home, but the thing barely flinched. Its flesh rippled like liquid, absorbing the impact. "Shit!" Garrett turned and ran, the creature's heavy, uneven footsteps pounding after him. The corridor twisted unnaturally, the walls warping as if trying to trap him. Garrett could feel the air growing thicker, pressing against his chest like a living thing. He rounded a corner and skidded to a halt. Ahead of him was another figure, this one smaller and humanoid, standing perfectly still. Its head was bowed, its hands clutching something small and metallic. "Help me!" Garrett shouted, but as he stepped closer, the figure lifted its head. It was Lena, or at least it looked like Lena. Her features were distorted, her eyes too wide and glowing faintly. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words that came out were alien, a garbled stream of overlapping syllables that made Garrett's skin crawl. "Lena," he whispered, his voice shaking. Her face split into a grin, impossibly wide, and she held up the object in her hands. It was a piece of the machine, a small, pulsing shard that hummed with the same unnatural energy as the monolith he'd seen in the heart of the ship. Before Garrett could react, she pressed the shard into her chest. Her body convulsed, her limbs twisting and elongating as the shard fused with her flesh. The glow in her eyes intensified, and a guttural laugh erupted from her throat. "Join us," she said, her voice now a chorus. Garrett turned and ran, the distorted version of Lena laughing behind him as the walls of the ship closed in. The corridors became a maze, each turn leading Garrett deeper into the ship's pulsating heart. He could feel it now, the machine's presence, vast and omnipotent, pressing against his mind like a tidal wave. "Garrett," it whispered, using his own voice. "You've seen the truth. Why resist?" He stumbled into a cavernous chamber, the walls alive with twisting patterns of light and shadow. At the center of the room stood the machine, its alien surface shifting and rippling like liquid metal. The air vibrated with power, and Garrett could feel his body weakening, his thoughts unraveling. The whispers grew louder, blending into a symphony of chaos. "You were chosen," the machine said, its voice a blend of countless others. "We offer unity. We offer transcendence." Garrett fell to his knees, clutching his head. The light from the machine washed over him, and for a moment, he saw everything. The Eidolon wasn't just a ship. It was a gateway, a nexus where realities converged. The machine's experiments had torn open the fabric of existence, allowing something vast and incomprehensible to seep through. The crew hadn't disappeared. They'd been consumed, reshaped into extensions of the machine's will. Garrett felt himself slipping, his thoughts dissolving into the collective. The carnival, the shadows, the impossible geometries. It was all part of the same entity, a single, endless organism stretching across dimensions. "No," he muttered, digging his fingers into the floor. I won't become part of you." The machine laughed, a sound that resonated through every fiber of his being. "You already are." As the walls closed in and the light consumed him, Garrett's scream echoed through the ship, blending seamlessly with the chorus of voices that had come before him. Let me know if you'd like the story to take another surreal twist or continue exploring the Eidolon's reality-bending horror. The moment the light consumed him, Garrett was certain he had ceased to exist. But then he felt the pull, not a physical sensation, more like the magnetic draw of an idea, an intangible gravity dragging him through layers of thought and perception. He was unmoored, a drifting consciousness tumbling through impossible spaces. Images flashed past him, too quick to process. 1,000 versions of the Eidolon, each one slightly different. One where the ship was pristine and bustling with life, another where it hung in a black void, fractured and silent. He saw himself, over and over again, fighting, screaming, surrendering. Each iteration felt real, but none of them were his. Then the voices returned, not as whispers, but as a deafening roar. "You see now," they boomed, their tones overlapping like an infinite choir. "There is no singularity, no you, only us." Garrett tried to scream, but he had no body. He was a formless thought, a fragment of awareness adrift in an ocean of minds. And then, suddenly, he landed. He woke on the Eidolon, or what he thought was the Eidolon. The corridors were sterile and pristine, the lights bright and steady. It looked like the ship as it had been before its descent into madness. But something was off. The air was too still. The shadows didn't move naturally. And there was a faint hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, vibrating just beneath the threshold of hearing. Garrett, a voice called. He turned sharply. Lena stood at the end of the corridor, her expression calm but unreadable. She was dressed in a clean, unmarked uniform, her features untouched by the distortions he'd seen before. "Is it really you?" Garrett asked, his voice hoarse. "It's me," she said, stepping closer. Her smile was thin, almost mechanical. "We've been waiting for you." "Waiting?" Garrett took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run. "What's going on? Where are we?" "This is the bridge," she said, gesturing to the walls around them. "The point of convergence. You're safe now." Her words didn't make sense. The bridge of the Eidolon had been destroyed, torn apart by the same forces that had warped the rest of the ship. Garrett's hand moved to his sidearm, only to find it missing. "What did you do to me?" he demanded. Lena's expression didn't change. "We helped you see. You've been chosen to join us." "Join what?" She didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head, and the walls around them began to ripple. The pristine corridor dissolved, replaced by a swirling void of light and shadow. Garrett staggered, his sense of balance unraveling as the space warped around him. In the center of the void, the machine loomed, larger than ever. Its surface shimmered with impossible colors, and its hum vibrated through Garrett's bones. Lena stepped toward it, her movements unnaturally fluid. "This is the truth," she said. "The Eidolon is no longer a ship. It's a vessel for something greater, something infinite." Garrett backed away, his mind reeling. "You've been changed. This isn't you." Lena's smile widened, stretching too far. "Change is inevitable," she said, her voice echoing with layers. "Resist and you'll suffer. Embrace it and you'll be free." The void began to close in, the machine's light growing brighter. Garrett felt the pull again, the same inexorable force that had dragged him into this nightmare. He fought against it, his thoughts clawing for a way out. "No," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I'm not part of you." "You already are," the voices replied, their tone almost amused. "But you haven't yet realized it." The light surged, blinding and all-consuming. Garrett felt himself unraveling, his thoughts fragmenting into 1,000 pieces. He screamed, but the sound was lost in the void. And then he was somewhere else. A vast, open field stretched before him, its surface made of shifting, liquid metal that reflected a sky full of swirling galaxies. The air was thick with the hum of the machine, but it was distant now, like the faint echo of a memory. Garrett looked down and saw his reflection in the metallic ground. For a moment, he looked like himself, but as he stared, his features began to shift, blending with countless other faces, some human, some not. He fell to his knees, his hands clutching the liquid surface. It rippled beneath his touch, and he realized with growing horror that it wasn't just reflecting him, it was part of him. "This isn't real," he whispered. "This can't be real." "It's as real as you make it," the voices said, surrounding him. "You're free now, Garrett. Free to create, to shape, to become." He shook his head, his thoughts spiraling. "No, this is wrong. I need to go back." "There is no back," the voices replied. "Only forward." As Garrett looked out over the endless expanse, he felt the pull again. This time, it wasn't external. It came from within, an insatiable urge to let go, to dissolve into the collective. But something deep inside him resisted. With a guttural scream, he plunged his hands into the metallic ground, the ripples spreading outward like shockwaves. The sky above him shuddered, the galaxies flickering like dying stars. "You can't fight forever," the voices said, their tone darkening. "The longer you resist, the more you'll suffer." "Then I'll suffer," Garrett growled, his grip tightening. "I'm not yours." The ground beneath him split open, and he was falling again, tumbling through infinite darkness as the machine's laughter echoed all around him. Garrett fell for what felt like an eternity. The darkness around him was thick, almost tangible, pressing against his skin like a living entity. Sounds echoed in the void. Fragments of the carnival music, the machine's hum, Lena's distorted laughter, all blending into a maddening cacophony. And then he landed. The impact knocked the wind out of him, though the surface beneath was unervingly soft, like flesh. He lay there for a moment, gasping for air, before pushing himself to his feet. The world around him was a nightmare, a twisted amalgamation of the idolatrous corridors, carnival structures, and bizarre organic forms. The walls pulsed with a faint blue light, veins of luminescence running through them like arteries. Shadows moved in the corners of his vision, darting just out of reach, and the air was filled with an eerie, rhythmic whisper. "Garrett," the voices said, softer now, almost seductive. "You've come so far. Why continue to fight?" "I don't want this," he muttered, clutching his head. "But it's already yours," they replied. Garrett staggered forward, determined to find something, an exit, a reason, anything to make sense of the madness. The corridors shifted as he walked, their geometry warping in impossible ways. One moment he was in a narrow hallway. The next, he was in a vast chamber with no discernible walls or ceiling. At the center of the chamber was a mirror. It stood tall and unadorned, its surface rippling like liquid mercury. Garrett approached cautiously, his heart pounding. As he drew closer, the mirror solidified, reflecting a version of himself, but not the one he expected. The Garrett in the mirror was pristine, untouched by the horrors of the Eidolon. His uniform was crisp, his expression calm and confident. But his eyes were wrong. They glowed faintly with the same blue light that pulsed through the ship. "Hello, Garrett," the reflection said, its lips moving out of sync with its voice. Garrett stumbled back. "You're not me." "Aren't I?" the reflection replied, stepping closer to the surface of the mirror. "I'm what you could be, what you should be." "I'm not joining you," Garrett said, his voice shaking. "I don't care what this is. I'm not part of it." The reflection tilted its head, smiling faintly. "You already are. Every step you've taken, every thought you've had, has brought you closer to us. Why do you think you're still alive? Why do you think you made it this far?" Garrett clenched his fists. "I made it because I fought, because I didn't give in." The reflection laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that reverberated through the chamber. "You think this is fighting? This is survival, Garrett. And survival is just another form of submission." The mirror began to ripple again, the reflection's image distorting. Garrett stepped back as a hand emerged from the surface. His hand, but not his. The flesh was pale and shimmering, the fingers unnaturally long. "You can't escape yourself," the reflection said, its voice now a chorus of overlapping tones. The hand reached for him, its fingers twitching. Garrett turned and ran. The corridors twisted around him, shifting and reshaping with every step. Doors appeared and vanished. Walls melted into pools of liquid metal. Garrett's lungs burned, his legs trembling as he pushed himself forward. Ahead, he saw a faint light, a shimmering doorway that pulsed with an otherworldly glow. It was the same light he'd seen when he first encountered the machine, and every instinct told him to avoid it. But it was the only thing in the shifting chaos that seemed remotely stable. He sprinted toward it, the whispers growing louder in his ears. "Come back," they said. "You're so close." He ignored them, throwing himself through the doorway. On the other side was silence. Garrett stood in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were bare, the floor cold and metallic. In the center of the room was a single chair, and sitting in it was Lena. Her head was bowed, her hands resting in her lap. She looked normal, human. "Lena," Garrett whispered, stepping closer. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was no glow, no distortion, just exhaustion and fear. "Garrett," she said, her voice trembling. "You have to end this." "End it," he repeated, confused. "The machine," she said, gesturing weakly, "is not alive. It's a tool, but it's broken. It's trying to remake everything, to force it into something it can control." Garrett shook his head. "I don't understand. How do I stop it?" Lena reached into her pocket and pulled out a small metallic shard. It pulsed faintly with the same blue light as the machine. "This," she said, "it's the core, the part that started all of this. If you destroy it, you might stop the process." "Might?" Garrett asked, taking the shard. Lena's expression darkened. "It's not just the ship anymore. It's spread. Reality itself is unraveling. Destroying this might save us, or it might tear everything apart." The walls around them began to pulse, the hum of the machine growing louder. "You don't have much time," Lena said. Garrett looked at the shard in his hand, its light pulsing in time with the machine's hum. He could feel its power, its connection to everything he'd experienced. "Garrett," the voices said, louder now, pressing against his thoughts. "You don't have to do this. We can give you peace, purpose, unity." He clenched the shard tightly, his mind racing. The walls were closing in, the light intensifying. He had to choose. Garrett stared at the shard in his hand, its pulsating glow syncing with the relentless hum of the machine. It was warm, almost alive, and the longer he held it, the more it seemed to burrow into his thoughts. The voices grew louder, swirling around him like a storm. "You've seen what we can offer," they said, no longer pleading but commanding. "Eternal connection, a release from pain. Why cling to the burden of individuality?" Lena was watching him, her face pale, her breathing shallow. "Garrett, don't listen to it. Destroy it. Whatever happens, this has to end." But the shard pushed back against her words, showing him visions. Garrett saw himself standing at the center of a vast, glowing web, his mind linked to countless others. He felt their thoughts, their emotions, their knowledge pouring into him. There was no fear, no loneliness, no doubt, only unity. And then the vision shifted. He saw the Eidolon, broken and adrift, its corridors collapsing into a singularity. He saw worlds unraveling, their skies folding inward, their inhabitants screaming as they were consumed by the machine's influence. He saw himself, twisted and hollow, a puppet of the entity that now whispered in his ear. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the chamber. The walls trembled, the glow of the shard intensifying. "Garrett," the voices said, a hint of warning creeping into their tone. "Think carefully. The universe will reject you. It will break you. But with us, you can be whole." Garrett gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on the shard. "I'd rather break than become another piece of your puzzle." Before the voices could respond, he raised the shard high and hurled it to the floor with all his strength. The shard shattered with an ear-splitting crack, releasing a burst of light so bright it burned through Garrett's closed eyelids. A wave of energy erupted outward, sending him and Lena sprawling as the room itself seemed to collapse inward. Garrett hit the ground hard, his ears ringing. He opened his eyes to chaos. The walls of the chamber melted away, revealing a swirling void of light and shadow. The machine screamed, a sound that defied description, as its perfect geometries fractured and collapsed. The hum of its power faltered, then stopped altogether, leaving behind an oppressive silence. Lena crawled toward him, her face twisted in pain. "Did it work?" she gasped. "I don't know," Garrett said, struggling to his feet. The void around them began to shift, its chaotic patterns stabilizing into something new. For a brief moment, Garrett felt weightless, as though he were suspended between worlds. And then reality snapped back into place. They were back aboard the Eidolon. The ship was quiet now, its corridors still and lifeless. The warped walls had returned to their original metallic form, and the pulsing blue veins were gone. Garrett and Lena stood in the heart of the ship, the shattered remains of the machine lying at their feet. "It's over," Lena said, her voice barely audible. Garrett wasn't so sure. The air felt heavy, charged with something unnameable. He looked around, half expecting the shadows to move again, but the room remained still. And yet, something gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. "We should go," Lena said, placing a hand on his arm. Garrett nodded, but as they turned to leave, a faint whisper reached his ears. It was his own voice, low and distant. "You think this is the end?" it said, a cruel laugh echoing beneath the words. "We're just getting started." Garrett froze, his blood running cold. He turned back to the remains of the machine, but the room was empty. "Garrett," Lena asked, concern in her voice. He forced a smile. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go." But as they walked through the silent corridors of the Eidolon, Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them. Something that wasn't finished. Something that never would be. The shuttle's engines hummed with life as Garrett and Lena settled into the cockpit. Beyond the viewport, the vast black void of space stretched endlessly, speckled with distant stars. The Eidolon loomed in the background, now inert and lifeless, a tomb drifting silently among the stars. Garrett's hands trembled as he keyed in the coordinates for their return. Lena sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the ship that had nearly claimed them both. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked, her voice quiet but heavy with exhaustion. Garrett hesitated. "We destroyed the core. The machine's dead." "Is it?" she pressed, turning to him. Her eyes searched his face, desperate for reassurance. Garrett didn't answer. He couldn't. The journey back to the nearest station was uneventful, but unease hung over them like a shroud. Garrett found himself glancing at the console's reflection, half expecting to see something behind him. The whispers were gone, but the silence left in their wake was worse. When they finally docked at the station, a sprawling orbital platform with bustling crews and bright, sterile corridors, Garrett felt an odd mixture of relief and dread. It was as if stepping back into the normal world made the events aboard the Eidolon feel even more unreal, more wrong. Medical teams swarmed them, checking for injuries and contamination. Garrett endured the poking and prodding in silence, his mind miles away. "You're clear," one of the technicians said finally, handing him a fresh uniform. "Get some rest. You've been through hell." Garrett nodded, muttering a quiet thanks before retreating to the quarters they'd assigned him. That night, Garrett dreamed. He was back on the Eidolon, wandering its endless corridors. The walls were alive again, pulsing with blue veins, and the air was thick with the hum of the machine. He heard the whispers, distant but growing louder. "You can't run from us," they said. He turned a corner and found himself in the heart of the ship. The machine stood before him, whole and unbroken, its surface rippling with light. Garrett tried to move, to run, but his body refused to obey. The machine loomed closer, and from its depths emerged a figure. It was him, the reflection from the mirror. The version of himself that had embraced the machine, its glowing eyes burning with cold intelligence. "You think you've won," it said, its voice a perfect echo of his own. "But you've only delayed the inevitable. The machine is more than wires and circuits. It's a seed planted in every mind it touches. And you," the figure pointed at him, a cruel smile spreading across its face. "You are fertile ground." Garrett woke with a start, his heart racing. Sweat drenched his body, and his hands shook as he wiped at his face. It was just a dream, he told himself. Just a dream. But as he swung his legs over the side of the cot, he caught a faint glow in the corner of the room. A shard of metal lay on the floor, pulsing with the same blue light as the machine. Garrett didn't tell Lena. He didn't tell anyone. He carried the shard with him, tucked away in a secure pocket. At first, he told himself it was a precaution, a way to keep it from falling into the wrong hands. But deep down, he knew the truth. The shard wasn't just an artifact. It was a reminder, a tether. As the days turned to weeks, Garrett began to feel its presence more acutely. He heard faint whispers when he was alone, saw flickers of movement in the corners of his vision. His dreams grew darker, filled with impossible geometries and endless voices. He tried to ignore it, to push it away, but the shard had become part of him. And then one night it spoke. "You can't fight forever," it said, its voice soft and almost gentle. "You know what you are, what you were meant to be." Garrett stared at the shard, his breath shallow. "I'm not yours," he whispered. "But you are," it replied. "You always were. The machine didn't create this. It revealed it. You were always part of the collective, Garrett. You just didn't know it." He closed his eyes, gripping the shard tightly. He wanted to throw it away, to destroy it, but he couldn't, because part of him didn't want to. Months later, Garrett disappeared. The station's log showed him boarding a shuttle alone, setting course for deep space. The crew found it odd. He'd been quiet but stable in the weeks leading up to his departure. Lena tried to reach him, but the messages went unanswered. The shuttle's transponder was deactivated shortly after it left the station. Lena sat in her quarters, staring at the final message Garrett had sent her. It was brief, cryptic. Asterisk, sometimes, to protect the ones you care about, you have to leave them behind. Don't come looking for me. Asterisk. She didn't know what it meant, but the weight of his words lingered. Far from the station, Garrett drifted through the void, the shard glowing faintly in his hands. He could feel the machine's presence now, vast and infinite, stretching across the stars. It called to him, promising answers, connection, purpose. For the first time, he didn't resist. As the light of the shard enveloped him, Garrett closed his eyes and let go. The Eidolon was gone, but the machine was not. It was out there, spreading like a virus, planting its seeds in the minds of the curious and the desperate. And Garrett had become its herald, carrying its message into the farthest reaches of space. Asterisk, you are fertile ground. Asterisk,